December 17, 1944, near Worth, Belgium. Snow fell in thick, heavy silence. The Ardennes forest was cloaked in white, its frozen stillness broken only by the distant rumble of artillery. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied lines and drive to Antwerp. Along a narrow country road, a small convoy of trucks from the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion moved cautiously through the storm. Inside one of them sat Sergeant Thomas Forte, bundled in his overcoat, his rifle resting between his knees. Around him were 10 other black American soldiers, cold, exhausted, but still holding onto the fragile rhythm of survival. They were supposed to be miles behind the front, providing artillery support with their 155 mm howitzers. But the German counteroffensive had moved faster than anyone expected. Enemy tanks were already cutting through the snowbound woods. Forte leaned forward, peering through the frost-covered windshield. "You hear that?" Private George Moten frowned. "Sounds like engines, a lot of 'em." The driver, Corporal James Stewart, tightened his grip on the wheel. "Keep your heads down. We might have just driven into something bad." Moments later, the roar of diesel engines erupted around them. German half-tracks burst from the tree, lean gray beasts marked with black crosses and SS runes. Bullets ripped through the windshield. "Ambush!" someone shouted. The men dove from the truck, scrambling through the snow as rounds tore into the convoy. One truck exploded in a fireball, the blast scattering bodies and debris. The air stank of burning fuel and cordite. Forte landed face first in the snow, heart hammering. He looked up to see Sergeant Curtis Adams returning fire with his M1 carbine, shouting, "To the ditch! Move!" The men crawled toward the roadside, firing blind into the trees. But the Germans had them boxed in, machine guns raking their position, shouting commands in guttural tones. "Hand hoch! Hand hoch!" They were surrounded. Forte's mind raced. He knew what capture meant. For white soldiers, it was imprisonment. For them, 4 black men in U.S. uniform, it could mean something far worse. He glanced at Adams, who shook his head slowly. "Don't do nothing stupid," Adams whispered. "We'll find a way out." But there was no way out. One by one, they laid down their weapons and raised their hands. SS soldiers closed in, rifles leveled, faces hard beneath their steel helmets. An officer with a scar running down his cheek stepped forward, smirking. "Neger Soldaten," he said. "Negro soldiers." The word dripped with contempt. The men were searched, their weapons kicked aside. One German struck Private Moten across the face with the butt of his rifle. The rest laughed. As the captives were herded toward the edge of the forest, Sergeant Forte caught the officer's eyes, cold, calculating, hateful. He knew, deep down, that this wasn't going to be a normal capture. The snow swallowed their footsteps as they disappeared into the woods, 11 men walking into the heart of darkness, unaware that what awaited them would become one of the most brutal, forgotten war crimes of the Second World War. The snow thickened as the SS patrol marched the captured Americans deeper into the forest. The men of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion were shivering, their breath turning to white clouds in the icy air. Their hands were bound with communication wire. No one spoke. Sergeant Thomas Forte walked at the front of the line, jaw clenched. He'd seen the look in the German officer's eyes, the same look he'd seen back home, from men in uniform who believed he didn't belong in his own. Only this time, that hatred was armed and unchecked. Private George Moten stumbled on the uneven path, falling to his knees. A rifle butt struck his back instantly. He grunted in pain, the snow beneath him staining pink. "Keep moving," barked the SS sergeant in clipped English. Forte turned his head slightly. "You all right, Moten?" The younger man nodded weakly. "Yeah, Sarge, just keepin' up." They emerged into a clearing of frozen field near the small hamlet of Worth. Smoke curled from the chimneys of a few scattered farmhouses. A farmer and his wife stood near a fence, staring in silence as the SS patrol passed. Their faces were pale, frightened, but they said nothing. To speak was to die. The officer leading the Germans, Untersturmführer Hans Langer, halted the column. "Here," he said in German. "No witnesses." The men were forced to their knees in the snow. The SS soldiers fanned out, surrounding them. Forte's heart pounded. He scanned their faces, young, terrified, but still composed. These were artillerymen, not infantry, yet they had endured the same front-line horror as anyone else. He tried to meet their eyes, one by one, as if to remind them of something bigger, of home, of decency, of hope. But hope was slipping away. Langer knelt in front of them, removing his gloves with deliberate slowness. His accent was smooth, his tone almost polite. "You are American soldiers," he said in English. "But not real Americans, yes?" No one answered. He stood, pacing behind them. "Your country sends you to fight us," he said, his voice rising. "But your own people do not want you. They think you are animals. So, what should we think?" Private First Class Ralph King whispered, "Don't listen to him, Sarge. He's just..." A gunshot cut him off. King slumped forward, a red hole in his temple. The clearing erupted in chaos, shouts, the crack of rifles, men falling one after another. Forte lunged toward the nearest soldier, screaming, but a blow from a rifle stock sent him sprawling into the snow. Blood poured down his cheek. The SS men were laughing now, not like soldiers, but like executioners. They moved methodically, one by one, through the kneeling line. Some of the Americans prayed. Others cursed. Forte looked up at the sky, snowflakes melting on his face. The world was so quiet he could hear the wind rustling the trees, a sound that would outlive them all. Then came the final gunshots. The forest went silent again. The SS patrol left as quickly as they'd come, vanishing into the storm. For hours, the bodies of 11 black soldiers lay scattered in the snow, unburied and unmourned. The war raged on, indifferent. It would be months before anyone found them. January 1945, WWII, Belgium. The snow had melted into patches of grey slush by the time the American counteroffensive reclaimed the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge was over, but the land was still scarred, littered with burned-out tanks and the frozen dead. In a small clearing outside WWII, a Belgian farmer named Matthias Langer trudged through the mud, searching for a missing cow. He'd survived the German occupation by sheer luck, feeding both sides when they came through. The war had made him cautious. But what he found that morning would haunt him for the rest of his life. Half buried under a drift of dirty snow were the bodies of American soldiers, 11 of them. Their hands were still tied behind their backs with wire. Their faces were mutilated, unrecognizable except for the olive drab uniforms and the patches of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion. Langer froze. The silence around him felt wrong, heavier than the winter air. These weren't men who had simply fallen in battle. This was something else. Something deliberate. He ran back to the village, shouting for the local priest. Within hours, U.S. military investigators arrived. Captain James O'Ryan, a war crimes officer attached to the 99th Infantry Division, was among the first to step into the clearing. The snow crunched under his boots as he surveyed the scene. Even for a man hardened by months of combat, it was almost too much to process. He knelt beside one of the bodies, brushing away frost. What he saw made his stomach turn: broken limbs, shattered teeth, bullet wounds to the head. Several had bayonet wounds. One had been shot through the eye. "Jesus Christ," muttered one of the medics. Ryan stood slowly, jaw tightening. "Get them covered," he said quietly. "Get them home." The medics worked in silence, wrapping the men in blankets, one by one. When they lifted the last body, Ryan saw something that stopped him: a small, half-burned Bible tucked into the dead man's jacket pocket. The initials on the cover read TF. Sergeant Thomas Forte. Ryan stared at it for a long time. Then he closed the Bible and slipped it into his coat. "We'll make sure they're remembered," he said. But history, as it turned out, wasn't ready to listen. The official report, case file 26, the Worth massacre, was compiled and sealed. The war was still raging in the Pacific, and the world's attention was elsewhere. The Nuremberg trials would soon expose atrocities on an unimaginable scale. 11 murdered black soldiers in a frozen Belgian field didn't fit the grand narrative of victory. The files were buried in archives, the names forgotten outside their families. The 333rd went back to fighting, and then home to silence. For decades, no memorial marked the site. No textbook mentioned it. The story survived only in whispers passed between veterans, told in fragments at reunions. It wasn't until 50 years later that the world would finally confront what had happened on that winter day in Worth and acknowledge that those men had been more than victims. They had been soldiers, patriots, and brothers who had faced evil without surrendering their humanity. But back in 1945, as the trucks rolled away carrying their bodies toward the temporary cemetery at Henry Chapelle, the snow began to fall again, covering the ground in a white silence as if the world itself was trying to hide the truth. Captain Ryan stood in the clearing until the last body was gone. He removed his helmet, closed his eyes, and whispered the only words that felt worthy. "Rest easy, boys. The world just doesn't know your story yet." Spring, 1945. The war in Europe was ending. But for the families of the men from the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, the silence was only beginning. Back in the United States, telegrams arrived one by one. The messages were short, cold, and almost identical. "We regret to inform you that your son has been killed in action." No details. No explanation. No mention of Worth. In Philadelphia, Mrs. Eleanor Forte unfolded her telegram at the kitchen table. Her hands trembled as she read the words that confirmed what she already feared. Her son, Sergeant Thomas Forte, had written just weeks before. "It's cold over here, Mama, but don't you worry. We're holding our ground. Tell the kids I'll be home by Christmas." Christmas had come and gone. She held the letter to her chest and whispered, "You did your duty, baby." The war ended in May. Newspapers blared headlines of victory, liberation, and the fall of Hitler's Reich. But not one mentioned the 11 black soldiers murdered in Worth. The 333 RDS records listed them simply as missing in action. When their remains were finally identified, they were buried in neat rows at Henry Chapelle American Cemetery, marked by white marble crosses that said nothing of how they died. For the men who had served alongside them, forgetting was impossible. Lieutenant James Stewart, who had commanded a sister battery, returned home haunted by what he'd seen. In interviews years later, he would say, "They fought like any other men. Maybe harder, because they had more to prove. But when it came time to honor them, the army just turned the page." The official investigation into the Worth killings was quietly closed in 1947. The perpetrators, believed to be members of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, were never identified, never charged. Too many records destroyed, too many witnesses dead. The case was labeled unresolved lack of evidence. And with that, the 11 men were erased from public memory. For decades, the story lived only in the memories of those who cared to tell it: Belgian villagers, aging veterans, and the families who refused to let their sons vanish into a footnote. One of those villagers, a farmer named Herman Langer, who had been a boy when the massacre happened, kept a small wooden cross on his family's land. He told anyone who would listen, "They were Americans, and they died here. It is our duty to remember them." Time passed. The Cold War began. The world moved on. But history has a way of resurfacing. In 1994, 50 years after the massacre, Herman's son, Matthias Langer, began researching the old stories his father had told. With help from local historians and surviving members of the 333rd, he uncovered the U.S. Army's sealed report. Its pages, yellowed and brittle, documented every brutal detail. That discovery led to something extraordinary. On May 23, 1994, in a field near Worth, a small group gathered under gray skies. American flags fluttered beside Belgian ones. A black granite monument was unveiled engraved with 11 names. Staff Sergeant Thomas Forte. Sergeant Curtis Adams. Corporal James Stewart. Private First Class Ralph King. Private George Moten. Private Nathaniel Moss. Private William Pritchett. Private Major Bradley. Private George Davis. Private James Leatherwood. Private Nathaniel Moss. For the first time, their story was spoken aloud where they fell. The U.S. Army sent a representative. The local priest offered a prayer. A bugler played taps. And for the families who had waited half a century, the silence finally broke. Worth, Belgium, present day. The wind sweeps gently across the open field where snow once hid the bodies of 11 brave men. The land is quiet now, the sound of birds, the hum of distant tractors, the rustle of trees that have grown over 70 years older. But if you listen closely, there is something else here, the echo of a story that refused to be buried. Each year, veterans, families, and locals gather at the Worth 11 Memorial. They come from across the Atlantic, Americans, Belgians, even Germans, to stand before the black granite monument where the names of 11 black soldiers are carved in perfect rows. A U.S. Marine Honor Guard presents the flag. The crowd stands in silence. And for a moment, the ghosts of the Ardennes are no longer forgotten. Among the attendees one year was Angela Forte, the granddaughter of Sergeant Thomas Forte. She placed a single folded letter at the base of her grandfather's name, the same letter he had written in 1944, the one her family had kept through generations. Her voice trembled as she spoke to a local reporter. They tried to erase what happened to them. But they couldn't. Because courage doesn't disappear, even when history looks away. The Worth 11 are no longer anonymous casualties. Their story, once hidden in a forgotten archive, is now part of the moral ledger of World War II, a reminder that heroism often begins where the world stops paying attention. In 2011, the U.S. Army finally recognized the Worth massacre as an official war crime. The event was documented in the military's historical record, and the 11 men were posthumously honored at a ceremony in Washington, D.C. But even beyond the medals and memorials, their story carries a deeper truth, one that resonates through every generation that comes after. These were soldiers who had already fought one war before they ever saw Europe, the war against prejudice in their own country. They served in a segregated army that denied them equal ranks, equal pay, and often, equal respect. Yet when the world's darkest hour came, they fought anyway. They marched into the cold forests of Belgium not for glory, but because it was their duty. And when they were captured, beaten, mocked, and murdered, they faced death with the same quiet dignity that had carried them through life. In the decades since, historians have uncovered the photographs, letters, and testimonies that piece together their final hours. The evidence is grim, but the message is clear: their sacrifice was not in vain. Their names, once lost, now stand as symbols of both tragedy and triumph. Today, the memorial at Worth stands on private land, tended lovingly by Belgian volunteers who never knew these men, yet refused to let them be forgotten. The granite gleams in the morning sun, surrounded by American and Belgian flags. And every year, when the bugle sounds and the rifles fire their salute, the world remembers, if only for a moment, what hate tried to erase. The snow falls lightly again, as it did that winter of 1944. It covers the ground where they lay, soft and quiet. But this time, it does not silence them. Because now, their story is told not as victims, but as soldiers. Not as statistics, but as men. And in that field in Worth, where the wind carries the faint echo of taps, the world is reminded that history may forget for a time but courage endures forever.